We are now going to look at the different ways we can summarize the value field and the different ways we can display the results of that calculation. Before we do, let's go back and refresh our memory. When we first looked at this data, remember we have the day, the time, the region, and so on of all these different customer orders, and the one variable we're interested in is this total cost, the total amount that the customer spent order by order. Earlier we went in and computed, outside of the pivot table, we simply computed the sum of the total cost values, which is the 61,527.21 that we have seen in our pivot tables. We also computed the average total cost, which turns out to be 153.82, and we also counted up the number of observations of total cost, and we have, as we've noticed before, a total of 400 of these records. Each one is describing one particular purchase made by a customer. So now I'm going to go back into my pivot table, and I'll click inside the pivot table to get my menu back, and now I'm going to go back to my value field, which is currently the total cost, and we're displaying the sum of total cost. And as we've seen, we have that sum broken out by day of week and by region right now. I'm going to click on that field, sum of total cost, which brings up a menu. One option is value field settings. I'll click on value field settings, and on the summarize values by tab, you'll notice I have a number of different ways I can summarize these: sum, count, average, and so on. Max, min, product, standard deviation, variance. Currently we're using sum. So all of the values in our pivot table, this is the sum. The 450.90 is the sum of the total Midwest sales on Sunday. Right? Let's change the selection to average. So we're still looking at the total cost variable, still broken out by day of week and region, but now what we're seeing is the average purchase quantity for Sunday sales in the Midwest, and the overall average for Sunday sales, and the overall average Midwest sales. Notice the grand overall average for the entire table is the 153.82 that we saw before. But again, we have it now broken out, that average, by day of week and region. I could also come back and choose value field settings and select count. Now I'm going to have to get rid of my formatting because this isn't really a dollar value anymore. So now we're seeing, of the 400 total observations, of the 400 purchases, 5 of them came from Midwest on a Sunday. Right? Total of 30 purchases were made on Sunday. A total of 71 came from the Midwest. Right? When we create a pivot table this way, when we're basically counting up the number of observations in cells, some people refer to this as a crosstabs or a crosstab table. And it's simply showing us the relative frequency of how many times we see an observation in each one of these cells. Now, when we see these different patterns, we may, if we want to check for statistical significance of the patterns we see Sunday, Monday, Tuesday in Midwest versus Northeast versus South and so on, we might want to do a chi-square test of independence. We're not going to cover that here, but it might be useful for you to go back and review that. So for the pivot table that I have created now, I can choose to summarize it by the sum, or by the average, or by the count, and any one of a number of other options that we could use to summarize the value of total cost. Another thing we can do with this now, I can click on this field, choose value field settings, and on the show values as tab, you'll notice right now we are doing no calculation. I might want to select percent of grand total. And if I choose percent of grand total and click OK, notice now we're seeing not the raw numbers but the percentages of the total. So the Sunday sales in the Midwest accounted for about 1.25% of the total observations. Now this is of the 400. Remember, we're summarizing the count of total cost. All right. The Sunday sales represent 7.5% of all the sales that were made, and the Midwest accounted for 17.75. I might also want to, rather than use percent of grand total, I might want to use percent of row total. Notice now this says Midwest sales were 16.67% of the total Sunday sales. Notice these numbers add up to 100%. So this is showing me among the Sunday sales how they were broken out among the Midwest, the Northeast, the South, and the West. Alternatively, I might want to go in the Show Values As and select percent of column total. Notice now the columns add up to 100%. So this is showing me within the Midwest what fraction of the sales come from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Right? Now remember, I'm using the count of total cost. So this is 7.04% of the orders that were placed on Sunday in the Midwest. Now if I go back to Value Field Settings and use Sum, we'll go back to the original Show Values As No Calculation. Right? Now we're looking at the total dollar value of sales Sunday in the Midwest and Sunday in the Northeast and so on. So if I change this setting to, for example, Show Values As percent of row total, right? Now it's showing me that of the total Sunday sales, 9.44% of the total value sold came from the Midwest, 26.31% came from the Northeast, and so on. If I change this to Value Field Settings, Show Values As percent of column total, right? Now again, referring to the sum of total cost, here's the breakdown of the total amount spent in the Midwest as it is spread across Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So for my value field, I have two things I need to decide. A, what am I going to summarize by? The sum, the count, the average, and so on. And then, how do I want to display that? As a raw number, or as a percent of the row, or a percent of the column?